Everybody, this is a very special evening that the South Asia Centre welcomes you to. I'm Mukulika Banerjee. I'll be playing the role of moderator only when absolutely required, mainly to make sure that we get as many of the complexities of this topic discussed this evening. Both our speakers today are people with a lot of ideas on the urgency of secularism, so I'm going to try and keep it moving along. The way we thought we would arrange this conversation between Professor Amartya Sen and Yogendra Yadav is to have perhaps a first 40 to 45-minute period when Yogendra and Amartya will be in conversation. And then we will take questions from the floor, and then there'll be more to say, obviously, in response to your questions. As you can imagine, the topic of this evening's discussion has been carefully thought through while we chose it. We may talk about the need for secularism, the crisis of secularism. Certainly in the Indian context, it has been an issue that we've thought about. It's in the fiber of the imagining of the nation. And it has been through a crisis and discussion for many decades. And arguably, perhaps to some, and not arguably to others, there is a real urgency to that crisis now in the contemporary political climate. And so we need to think about the intellectual trajectories, genealogies of this idea in India, but also more comparatively, and where India stands in this discussion on secularism. We have Professor Akhil Bilgrami here from Columbia, who has, of course, written about this extensively. It's a delight that you're here, sir. I'm going to invite first Yogendra, who, as many of you know, is a trained political theorist, political scientist, psephologist, commentator on television. Many of you have seen him. But also now, in his current priorities, a political activist. So there are issues of secularism on the ground that need to be addressed, which I will invite Yogendra to talk about. Professor Amartya Sen, of course, as we all know in this room without exception, has written about secularism and its discontents many years ago, but about a wide range of topics. And I'm going to invite Amartya to really reflect on those those writings and where his thinking is on these issues now. And I'm hoping that Yogendra has been tasked with challenging some of those ideas so we can have not too much agreement on stage. Otherwise, we can all sort of speak. Yeah, and you have your job cut out for you, so you need to challenge Amartya. And Amartya, I should say, wanted to be challenged. He was not going to give a lecture today, and he wanted somebody to challenge him. So I'm delighted that Yogendra, who we're very grateful to the Ralph Miliband program at LSE, who invited him to deliver the Ralph Miliband lecture last night, who several of you were there at, and he could stay on and do this for us. So over to you, Yogendra, to make your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mukulika. Thanks to the South Asia Centre at LSE for this opportunity. Who wouldn't want to share a stage with Amartya Sen? So delighted, honored that he thought of me as the interlocutor. For some reason, Mukulika informed me that he wanted me to be the interlocutor. I'm honored, little intrigued why he wanted a political activist to perform this role. The choice of the topic, urgency of secularism. Urgency reminds us of a certain immediacy, time, swiftness, urgency also carries with it something else, a sense of priority, a sense of significance. And I guess it's both that we are talking of. Amartya might speak of the larger context because he can. I would confine much of what I have to say about India. That's the only place I understand somewhat. Urgency of secularism, in a sense I understand, in a sense I don't understand. Urgency of what exactly? Secularism could mean 4 different things. And I thought it may be an interesting way to start thinking. So let me make some cryptic, provocative statements to open this conversation and to live up to Mukulika's challenge. Secularism could mean secular principle, which is a constitutional principle, which is, of course, a foundational principle. I can only put it in one sentence. In the context of India, I say that without any hesitation. We either have a secular India or we have no India at all. There is no third way. It's that deep, it's that foundational a principle that we are talking about. So, of course, what is the challenge then? The challenge is to reaffirm that principle, and especially in the context of what has been happening in the country for the last 4 years. This is really something that demands every ounce of political and intellectual energy, something that might demand some lives to be completely devoted to this. This is, so at the moment in India, we are facing a challenge to the very foundations of republic. And that is, so from urgency of secularism, I could understand urgency of recovering that principle, reaffirming that principle, which is at the very core of the idea of India. But secularism could mean other things as well. Secularism could mean a set of policies, state policies. What has been our record? When I look at state policies, I'm always unsure of what we have exactly practiced. Secular policies have been, if secular principle is foundational, secular policies are deeply flawed. On the one hand, we have had policies which seemed to favor one community. I mean, have we been symmetrical in treating all communities as secularism would require? The answer is maybe not. Sometimes favoring one community, at least its elite. Let me be more specific and more provocative. What we have done in the name of secular policies is appeasement of the minority clergy and a complete neglect of minority citizens. So what does it mean? What does urgency of secularism mean in this context? To my mind, urgency of secularism in the context of policy would mean repair. We need to repair these policies. Secularism could mean politics, secular politics. At least in the domain of electoral politics, a certain set of political parties and movements carry the description secular. What has been their record? If secularism as a principle is foundational, if secularism as policies have been flawed, I say without hesitation, secularism as politics has been fraudulent. It's fraudulent because what we have practiced in the name of secularism is actually politics of keeping minorities hostage. Specifically, Muslim minorities have been kept hostage by parties that claim to be secular. So what is our challenge today? Our challenge is to completely redesign that politics. What is secular about politics that calls itself secular? Very little. And finally, secularism could mean, shall we say pedagogy, just to continue with peace? Or secularism could mean a set of intellectual practices. And there again, my sense is that record has been very dismal. Secular intellectual practice has been very inconsistent. What we have in the name of secularism are two kinds of things. One, complete ignorance about religion. At least in India, for the last 50, 60, 70 years, we have cultivated illiteracy about religions. We call it secularism. I don't know why. Or we have cultivated, in the recent 20 years or so, not just indifference, a certain kind of hostility. Let me be specific and continue with my promise of being provocative. I think we've turned Hindu bashing into a fashion, an intellectual fashion, in the last 25, 30 years or so, which has had very serious costs. And so what we are witnessing today, where that absolute foundational principle of the idea of India is being shaken, the easiest thing in this room would be to say it is by these forces, and you know what we are talking about, BJP, RSS, and what they have been up to, that dangerous propaganda, that spreading of lies, poison, thuggery that's going on in the country today. But I think in this room we would be doing injustice to ourselves, to the challenge, unless we recognized some of the deep flaws in the practice of secularism. So I hope this conversation about urgency of secularism would be both about urgency of affirming the secular principle, but also about recasting the secular practice. That's all I would say to begin with.
Thank you.
Good.
Now you're going to speak for 5. He's stuck to his 5. He's had 7 minutes. So you can
How much time did you give him?
I gave him 7. I know you will check. So he's had, I can't say
You
5.
gave him 7 and you
No, I
took
gave him
7.
5. He took 7. I'm giving you 7. You can have up to 8.
A friend of mine, Peter Diamond, an economist, who stopped in the motorway at a time when the speed limit was being reduced to 60. And no, actually, the speed limit was reduced to 50 for a while. There was a great belief in America that you reduce accident and save the environment, which of course Americans do not think about anymore, but at that time they did. And Peter was stopped, and the chap said, "You know how fast you were going?" And he said, "No." And he said, "Well, you're going 70. He said, "The speed limit is here 50, so you must not exceed 60. So Mukulika 7 minutes has that feature, that is 8 minutes. So I think I'll begin with, since actually Mukulika encouraged me, with some earlier thoughts which are very much encouraged by Yogendra's comments, and which are excellent comments indeed, and with which I'm very much in agreement. This may disappoint him because he was trying to disagree, but then you don't succeed always. So
We'll get there.
We'll get there, okay. But one of them is that there are two centers of secularism, and I think there's a kind of division between a Western and for the want of a better term, Indian way of looking at it. Basically, when you describe something as secular here, it tends to be nothing to do with something that avoids being contaminated by religion and such. And so it is secular now, and it's not secular because some religious thing is involved. And the other is the idea that secularism is being equidistant to the different religions. There are two ways of doing it, either all religion that exists or religion that your own population happen to have. To my mind, though I know that this has been disputed by friends like Ram Goa in my case, that I think this idea really goes back to Akbar. Namely that what you're trying to do is that if you cannot treat one group as being a favorite as opposed to another. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't protect someone's right to religious liberty, for example. The state may do something to prevent the violation of religious liberty in a way that John Stuart Mill would have been happy to hear. And the example that Akbar was doing it in a particularly interesting context. It's the first 1,000 years in the Muslim Hijra calendar. That's when he is doing it at the end of the 16th century. But the examples he gives are of that kind. I mean, Abul Fazl gives, who is the one person who is keeping track of what Akbar is saying. I think it's interesting, by the way, to ask why is it that Ashoka, who is in many ways similar in terms of tolerance, doesn't quite have that perspective. His argument is much more foundational, that you should listen to others, even if you don't agree. And if you disrespect other people's argument, you weaken your own faith. Not quite. Akbar's is a political argument, and it's political constitutionalism. As such, it fits into between your first category and on the political category to which you are mentioning. And I think it's a big difference. I remember one occasion when I was getting my an honorary degree in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. I asked the Vice Chancellor, I said, is this going to be a secular ceremony or a religious one? And he said, oh, no, strictly secular. So the function began, and we had 2 minutes of reading from the Quran. Then we had 2 minutes of reading from the Bhagavad Gita. Not a good choice, by the way, if you have to go by the Hindu scripture. In fact, one of the more expendable, I think, part, because it's an argument. It's not clear that Krishna wins the argument either. Anyway, so there's Gita. And then there were 2 minutes of reading from the Bible. And then 2 minutes of reading from the Tripitaka, from the Buddhist scripture, as it were. In what sense is it secular? Well, because it didn't discriminate between them. And it won't be seen as secular in the European context, actually. It will be seen as multi-religious. And I think that sense is quite important in India, and it's important among our great people, if you think in a very different way, say take Gandhiji. Mahatma Gandhi, I think he did Ramdhoon and his religious thing pretty much every day. On the other hand, I don't think there is a case where in the political meeting of the Congress he would favor Hinduism in any way. Indeed, in 1931, when he comes here and he is being described by his British host as being a Hindu leader, then he said that I'm not a Hindu leader. And So I think that's an important thing, and it's true in a slightly different way. It's true of Rabindranath also, partly because Thoreau was not a political guy, but of course, I mean, he was religious, no question about that. Yeats and Ezra Pound between them may have exaggerated it beyond belief. On the other hand, he had those religious thoughts, certainly, and yet that would not hold him prisoner when it comes to describing himself. In fact, in his Hibbert lecture, which is on the religion of man, where he describes what am I, and he describes himself, I've forgotten the exact wording, that I am actually a product of three civilizations, Hindu, Muslim, and the Western. And the three together, make me what I am. I think that sense is extremely important for the reason that Akbar recognized. Why did Akbar go into it? I mean, he is very early in the Mughal Empire, if you think. I mean, his grandfather had established the empire, even though he spent most of his time missing the area that he came from, where it is easy to get good, juicy melons in a way that you couldn't get in arid Delhi. So that was his big complaint. Babur's complaint was that. Babur had a lot of other interesting thoughts too about those who claim to be to prophesy. And he said, well, it can't be right. He was worried that his military was being disheartened by someone saying you would lose this war. And he said, you know, I can show that you're wrong because I can ask you to predict something and about whether you continue to live or not, and I can kill you, and so that you cannot be such a clairvoyant person. And then, of course, Akbar's dad lost the empire, pretty much. It was pushed out by the Pathans. And then, of course, he reestablishes Akbar. So I think he's barely had a chance to settle down, and he is already doing what secular practice, like having say Man Singh as the commander of the army. At the same time, also doing these things about what's the duty of a king, what's the duty of the state, particularly, namely that if somebody's religious freedom is being violated, you have to protect it. And I think that becomes increasingly important now. I don't know whether it is the case that the present government actually does a lot to make the life of Muslims more precarious and miserable. It probably does. But even those who don't, among them, it's not adequate to say they are not doing it. It's some stray elements in RSS and so on. The fact is that you ought to do some. What are you doing to protect? What are you doing to protect the guy who allegedly has beef in his refrigerator? And that's a complete failure in a way that Akbar was recognized. And I believe that the Constituent Assembly takes note of that a great deal. Not quoting him often enough, but I think there I would say I think Ram Gahor is wrong in taking the view that Akbar didn't have that role in the making of the Indian Constitution.
Can I hold you there?
Yeah.
And on the contemporary reference.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Because tempting as it is to get into the intellectual genealogy, and the point that the distinction between Ashoka and Akbar is actually something I would have liked to, proceed. But it's your contemporary reference that invites me to, focus on that, because given the overall context, and also the fact that, in a sense, there would be a lot of agreement here, probably amongst many of us sitting here, that while the word secularism makes to our constitution much later, the foundational values of our constitution are secular. But even before that, the freedom struggle has come to that consensus. And they are drawing upon something which is much prior to that. So secularism is not something that suddenly makes its entrance in the Constitution of India. We're dealing with something which has much deeper lineage. But I wouldn't get much into that. You made a quick reference to what's happening right now in the country. And that's what I wanted to draw your attention to. In 1996, you wrote that essay on secularism and its discontent, which in a sense systematically deals with many misconceptions about secularism in India. As a political activist, when I travel in the country today, I find minorities feel very insecure, and I understand why they do. They feel very insecure. Among Muslims, there is clearly a sense of having been relegated to a second-grade citizenship in the country. I read someone like Julius Ribeiro, and when I read what this super cop hero of India, I mean, it just breaks my heart to read what he's writing.
This is the Kashmir guy.
No, yeah, Julius Ribeiro, who was the police chief in Punjab.
Oh, Punjab, yeah.
He wrote last week to say, look, I'm prepared to be a second-rate citizen of this country, but don't call me anti-national. So it just breaks my heart to read something of that kind. But the strange thing, interesting, strange, weird thing is, when I speak to ordinary Hindus, I find them insecure as well. Where does that, there's a deep anxiety. An ordinary Hindu on the street, and when the Muslim carries that anxiety, I can easily understand. I just have to read the newspaper headlines and I know why they feel insecure. I meet others, I understand that. But when I speak to a set of Hindus in Gurgaon last month about that, the namaz dispute that took place, I find they all carry a certain anxiety. Where does that anxiety come from? Is it all completely flimsy? What is it?
Yeah. Let me make one first point before I come to that about Akbar and Ashok. You see, Akbar had no religious campaign priority. Ashok clearly did. In fact, but for Ashok, Buddhism would not have been spread across the world. And country after country, from the beginning with Sri Lanka, but there's a lot of hidden evidence that's true of Thailand and so on, where he sent envoys and he wanted to spread. Akbar didn't have any such program. I mean, he remained a Muslim and claimed that this is where he talks about Vahiyakal, that is a part of reasoning that got him there. It's not that he is not a Muslim, but that he was not obliged to be a Muslim because he comes from a Muslim family. He had to choose still, and he chose that way. And in fact, the head priest of Delhi, when Akbar died, said that, well, we disagreed a lot, but I have to say that in terms of his life, he had led a life which could describe him as really being a Muslim, chosen by him. But I think he was also arranging, that was his personal thing, but he was arranging these discussions with, in Fatehpur Sikri, and there's a lot of tradition, there's a little bit of tradition indicating that one of those Sufi and Bhakti inspired leaders, Dadu, not Kabir as such, but Dadu, who actually, I think it's an apocryphal story, that Akbar apparently spent 40 days chatting with him on that. But he's curious and he is also interested in people spreading out. So I think the Ashok Akbar contrast arises from the fact that Akbar, having no religious program in a way that Ashok did have. But coming to the present day thing, I agree a lot of Hindus feel insecure. And there's lots to feel insecure about in India, from economic anxiety, from social anxiety, from group-related violence anxiety. But they don't feel that anxiety precisely because they are Hindus, in a way that a Muslim has reason to feel in today's world in India. Because they may feel that, you know, you are strayed into a communal strife between two caste groups. But that's not because you're a Hindu difficulty, because you belong to one caste group rather than another. It's a kind of social background of the Romeo-Juliet kind of type, of that kind of hostility. But I think the sense of vulnerability of being a Muslim, and in some cases being a Christian too, has been quite strong in the present context.
Sorry, Amartya, so are you saying the anxiety of Hindu anxiety is different from Muslim anxiety?
Pardon?
Hindu anxiety is different from Muslim
I wouldn't call it
anxiety.
Hindu anxiety. Anxiety of people who happen to be Hindu. I'm saying it's not a Hindu anxiety. In a way, the anxiety of many people who are Muslim could be seen as a Muslim anxiety, because their problem arises precisely because they're Muslims.
No, I understand what you're saying, but what I see on the ground is something slightly different. Looking from outside, if you look at the data, statistics, if you look at objective reality, yes, what you are saying should be the case. In the case of Muslims, there is every reason for them to be anxious about, given what's happening in the country. I mean, they just have to pick up the newspaper and see what's happening in the country. But when I speak to Hindus, there is a Hindu-related anxiety, not the other ones, economic anxiety, caste anxiety. Those are different things.
But do you run into people who say, look, I am a Hindu, gosh, I feel very insecure for that reason?
How is it? I mean, this is something I encountered for the first time in Gujarat after 2002. I traveled. And if you were to go by what the ordinary Hindus on the street were telling you, Muslims were probably 40–50% of Gujarat's population. They were controlling everything in Gujarat. Muslims were very, and in fact, that's exactly how my conversation ended in Gurgaon. You know, I was there leading a delegation in Gurgaon next to Delhi. A month ago, there was this controversy about Muslims being able to offer prayer, namaz, the Friday namaz in public. And because certain RSS organizations had, you know, they went around, they created a lot of tension around that question. So some of us went there to, you know, to speak to ordinary Hindus other than the aggressive ones. And what I noticed was actually that many of them were saying they were actually feeling anxious about the presence of so many Muslims. I said, how many Muslims do you have in Gurgaon? I know the place, I was born there. I said, how many Muslims do you have there? There are too many. I said, but how many? You know, there are too many. How much is too many? Where do you notice? I said, you know, really honestly, are you telling me that, you know, on the street you feel a threat from the presence of Muslims? I said, look, I've known this place. Don't tell me you know, on the streets you feel insecure. So there is, the only reason I'm pushing this point is to bring back to what I had said initially. We could simply say false consciousness. This is not reality. Don't know where they get these notions from. These are weird notions. Forget about it. Or we could try and understand what this perception is all about. Has something gone wrong in the secular practice to create these kinds
Well,
of
many
perceptions?
things have gone wrong in the secular program, including there were lapses from secularism in what was allegedly secular program, and Congress is pretty guilty of that. But I can't, you say false consciousness is a complicated story about objective illusion. There may be something of that there, but there's a bit of paranoia there too, I would have thought. Because to say I feel very afraid because there are lots of people, other communities here, that's not a normal human thought. I mean, that's really a paranoid thought, because it's a normal state of any society other than very, I don't know, if you were living in a Viking world, perhaps you have never met anyone other than a Viking, and you may feel very worried if you find 3 or 4 non-Vikings walking around. But I think it's not a very natural thing to feel worried about the presence of other community. In the case of Muslims, the asymmetry is that something has been done to people precisely because they're Muslim. And I think there's an asymmetry. Maybe we'll come back to that point, because I said that 2 points I was going to make, I made 1. Okay? So the other is and here there is more to learn from Ashok than from Akbar, probably. From both, but from Ashok more. Namely that we live in a world which is more than our country. Ashok was in that sense an internationalist, in a way that very few of the Indian kings were. We take great pride in not having established an empire, but that's not quite true either. Whenever they could, they did, in Indochina and Indonesia and so on. But and that's not only Hindus, by the way. The Indonesian Islamic conversion, that's the largest Muslim country in the world, was primarily moved by Gujarati Muslims. That's where the Gujarati Muslims had played a major part. And I talk with Muslim scholars in Indonesia who point out which particular way you could discriminate between the version of Islam that came from Indonesia, from India, and from Gujarat in particular. So what there have been is, but generally people haven't tried to, run the world. When Sheldon Pollack discusses, for example, that for almost 1,000 years Sanskrit was the lingua franca of the world, that wasn't imposed. It's just that a world that's influenced by Hindus but strongly Buddhist in many ways had to read Sanskrit to learn the literature in the same way Latin became a thing, even when people were not trying to read only the Bible. So I think in the secularism, that is where you are open to traditions without asking where is this tradition from. That in a sense, I think it will fall into your category of the last one, the intellectual secularism. I think there is an enormous urgency of that to prevent us from being the kind of, the Sanskrit word kupamanduk, that is the frog in a well. I don't know how many people here know that. Kupa is a well and frog is there's a frog in the well. It has a world view, but the world view is based on what it can see inside the well. And so there's a danger of a world view which keeps us confined. And secularism is one of the ways of liberating ourselves. And if there's great pride, reason for pride, that India did have, at least in periods of history, a kind of receptive thing, interested in the Jews who came to India in the first century, shortly after the fall of Jerusalem. The Christians came and from the 3rd century, St. Thomas the Apostle is supposed to have come earlier than that, but we don't know. There was curiosity about that. The curiosity also about Zoroastrians and the Parsis. Curiosity about Islam also, even before the conquest, through the Muslim traders, going back all the way to the Baha'is. And India did not generate the Baha'is, that was Iran. But on the other hand, it had curiosity about it, and there are more Baha'is in India than anywhere else in the world. It's like 20 times more. So I think there is that openness. And there are all sorts of lovely stories. The one which I like is St. Thomas the Apostle is charmed by, this is completely apocryphal, no truth in this at all, but completely charmed by a beautiful singing coming as it lands in India. And this is the Jewish girl sitting on the shore of the sea singing a song. So I like this idea of this Christian apostle arriving and being charmed by a Jewish Indian singing a song. I think it captures an enormously rich aspect of that aspect of India, which is also true, it's there. And there was a third point I would say, that by denying secularism, to the extent that Hindus do it, and of course most Hindus don't, and we have to remember when we say that Hindu, this is not a declaration of an earthquake coming or nothing like that.
Only Yogendra gets a heads up.
So I think we miss out something of which one could have been very proud. And India was not alone in that. I mean, that was any kind of intellectual civilization which has survived and flourished has had that feature of there being secular acceptability. Yeah? When an Iraqi scholar would spend, as a Muslim Iraqi scholar, spend some time whether what are Indians most proud of, and he discusses whether, I've forgotten the name of the guy, but it's in my book, Argumentative Indian, whether it's chess or the decimal system, which are Indians most proud of. When you're discussing that, there is a expand. Similarly, Al-Biruni, a Muslim scholar from Iran who wrote only in Arabic, he produces, I think the best book on India. At last it was written in 1012 AD, so things have happened since then. But
a few things, yeah.
It's called Tariq al-Hind, that is the history of India. And that's where he discusses pretty much enormous amount the debate between the mathematicians. He himself was a mathematician. But he discusses, and then he also discusses the debate between Brahmagupta, who was, according to Al-Biruni, a better mathematician than Aryabhat, but didn't have the courage of Aryabhat, nor the innovativeness. And he takes Brahmagupta to task, saying, why did he join others in denouncing Aryabhat for going against the scriptures about the eclipse of the moon and the eclipse of the sun, and the earth going around, the earth rotating around its axis, and so on. And there's a lovely passage where he ends, this is also in Tariq al-Hind, that if I met him today, what would I ask Brahmagupta? I have to acknowledge that he is the best mathematician I know, even better than Aryabhat. However, I have to ask him, though he is dead 400 years, I have to ask him if you really think so badly of Aryabhat and criticize it, in order to please those whom you think you ought to please, why is it that when it comes to predicting the eclipse, you follow Aryabhat's method rather than following those whose scriptural statements you back? So I think this is a time when the Arabic Iranian civilization extending all the way to the Atlantic was, and it all includes Cordoba and Spain and so on, had that magnanimity which also allowed them to translate Plato and Aristotle, so much so that when they had to revive Plato and Aristotle, they couldn't find initially they couldn't find a proper Latin translation, so they had to retranslate the Arabic translation of Latin text into Latin again. So I think...
If I could drag you to a few things that have happened since Al-Biruni. I find this fascinating, your definition of secularism as being open to traditions without asking which tradition I should follow. I mean, that really gives a new way of thinking about it. But in order to do so, you have to have some literacy. Have we not destroyed that literacy completely? I look at you. You are, above all...
You're asking me, but I've destroyed something?
No, we. I mean, this is something really bothers me. I mean, when I look at you personally, you, above all, I see as a Bengali intellectual, you're rooted in Bengali. You write with some felicity with Sanskrit. You're familiar with these things. So if someone says, here is a deracinated westernized intellectual, that would certainly be untrue. But would that not be a good characterization of much of the modern intellectuals that we have produced post-independence India? To me, it's a very serious question in thinking about secularism. Are we, and when I say we, it means post-independence Indian elite, are we not guilty of creating a cultural vacuum in which Mr. Modi walks in?
Explain a bit more. How have we created?
A few things. To begin with, word, as is, I think, reasonably well known, we do not have a translation of the word secularism. A decent translation of this word, Dharma Nirpekshta in Hindi, is as bad as it can get. And most of the Hindi scholars I know use the word secular just to get it. So there's a word. There's a problem of language, which is most of the secular discourse takes place not in the languages in which 99% of people in this country in India operate, but primarily in English language. There is the problem not just of language, but also of metaphors, of the worldview. I'll just give you one instance, this tiny story. I can't tell nice stories. But that tiny story is of 6 December 1992. Like many secular fools, I believed that nothing would happen that day, that this was one of the little dramas BJP was enacting.
You remind people what
6 December 1990. 6 December 1992 is when Babri Mosque demolition takes place in Ayodhya.
A lot of people know it.
Yes,
but
yes.
not everyone.
I should not have presumed. Which is it's a watershed moment in the history of contemporary India. RSS BJP carries a nationwide campaign for almost 2 years, which constantly says, we are about to demolish this mosque, we are about to demolish this mosque. On 6 December 1992, they once again said, we are about to do it. And people like me said, one more thing, they are not going to do it. And it happened. It happened in front of the whole world. I thought my whole world had collapsed. Honestly, that day I thought was, I personally thought this was the beginning of the end of India as I had known it. I didn't And those days I used to teach in a university, lived just outside Chandigarh, was fed up with Chandigarh as a city, used to live in a working class colony there. And there was a little, very gentle Indian-style curfew, which is to say you could go out, but not quite into the city. So I went out and met all my neighbors and wanted to discuss with them. This person who was a fruit seller, this person next door who used to keep pigs, the person who would ply a tanga. I went and met all of them and spoke to them and said, something very bad has happened in this country. Do you know about it? They said, what, Professor Saab? So I told them what I thought was this terrible thing that has happened. And they said, Professor Saab, Ram ka mandir yahan nahi to England mein banega kya? Will we have Ram temple in England, if not here in Ayodhya? My language of liberalism, secularism, constitutionality, Supreme Court orders had zero purchase. Next morning, Prabhash Joshi wrote an article in Jansatta in Hindi, which was his front page editorial, which said, Maryada Purushottam ke naam par kalank. This is a blot on the name of Lord Rama, who is Maryada Purushottam. That gave me a language to speak to those very people. I've never forgotten that day and how completely incapacitated I felt. All my learning, all my training, all my wisdom was of no consequence. I needed to learn a new language. When I now look at, this is 25 years old, how many of us have learned that language? Today, once again, we find ourselves in the same situation. These, forgive me for saying, thugs are around. Thugs use a language of tradition, of Hinduism. And those who want to defend this civilization do not have a language. Most of the intellectuals, most of the modern educated Indians are illiterate about their own traditions. I don't speak of one tradition. I don't want everyone to be educated in Gita. But something about those traditions. We have created generations after generations of illiterates. There is a deep cultural vacuum. And it is in that cultural vacuum that RSS BJP makes an intervention. No, not just RSS BJP. Tabligh also does it. A lot of Muslim organizations do it. Shiromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee the other day says we shall have our own censor board. Everyone keeps quiet. Yeah. This is what's happening here. Aren't we in that sense responsible?
I think Mukulika is getting there by your and my combined verbosity. And
well,
he wants you to,
must be fair
but can I just take
yes,
that point?
Of course, and then we must take some questions.
Then absolutely we will. I'm not so, I find your position a little elitist there. Yeah, I don't mean elitist in the way the term is used now. It's just unbelievable. Elitist is powerful. And when a completely illiterate military coup happens, and then you think they are now going to carry out policies in favor of the elite. I mean, these chaps can't even spell. I mean, this is unbelievable. But you are being elitist in the big sense, that it has to have a big idea. I don't think Indian secularism, the glory of it has been in the big theories. Actually, even in terms of what I was quoting out when I spoke, when you think of them, they're very elementary theories. That, this is a country of Hindus, Muslims, and then others, and as a king, it's my role to protect all of them. And why? Well, there could be many reasons. So if somebody were to say, this is a shame in the name of Rama and, in Lord Rama, well, it's an argument that shouldn't appeal to you, I think. On the other hand, you can see it as a means of communication. This is a big subject, and in fact the big debate between Gandhiji and Rabindranath Tagore about the Bihar earthquake was on that. Gandhiji was using a language which could communicate, he thought, against untouchability, when Tagore thought that was completely unacceptable. But you see, I think the secularism in India has survived not on elitist support. I think it is remarkable that there has never been in the history of India a big riot which begins in a rural area. They always begin in some urban area, then spreads to the hinterland of that. And there is a kind of understanding of illiteracy, even of exploitation. There's a story you were earlier on asking me this afternoon about my grandfather, who also had a book on Hinduism of a very different kind from the one that Modi would approve of. But it's one of his letters, he is recollecting his elder brother, who were in Albany Mohan. He lived in the same village in Bikampur in Dhaka area. And one of his close friends was the Muslim priest, the Qadi of that area. So he would go there every evening to have hookah, have smoke. And so his brother described that the two of us were having a good smoke when there was this Hindu priest who was fasting, and my host, that is the Muslim priest, said, "Why come and join us? We're having great tobacco session, great hookah session here." And to which they said, "Look, I really can't join you because, you are a Muslim priest, and I'm a Hindu priest, so our beliefs are different. I believe your beliefs are all wrong. And it's not possible for me, as a Hindu priest, to join you in this adda." Now, Kittiman Sen, my grandfather's elder brother, said, to which this Muslim priest said, "You exaggerate our different. As a Hindu priest, your job is to make money and lead a good life by deluding the illiterate Hindu population. And it's my job is to make money and lead a good life by deceiving the illiterate Muslim population. So we have exactly the same profession." Now that argument is not an elitist argument, but I think it had played a very big part in a sense of symmetry, which is what is driving here. And I think the big protection from riots in rural areas had been that sense of symmetry, rather than any grand idea. But we can discuss it, and I don't think she wants us to discuss it now.
We can discuss it while you're answering questions. Okay, so we have just under half an hour to take some questions. So let's start with the young lady here. I'll take a couple of questions at a time. Is that okay? And you both don't have to answer every question. Please take your, yeah.
Thank you for the engaging discussion. I'm Anushna Jha, and I'm
Can you hold it and shout? I'm all kinds of disability with age, and I also have some treatment from prostate cancer, which has affected, I can't walk very easily, nor can I hear very easily. So can you just shout? It won't be...
And I'll repeat it to you. So.
Yeah, well, that may be overdoing, but depending on how much...
If you need it. If you ask me to, I'll be happy to.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm a student here in the Department of International Development. Mr. Yadav, you mentioned this distinction between the extremist, aggressive Hindus who are associated with what we call the Sangh Parivar, and then the Hindus who do not associate with that kind of ideology. How have those minority Hindus not just legitimized their position in terms of electoral victories, but also managed to appropriate the entire idea of being a Hindu? How have they managed to do that?
Okay, let's take one more question there at the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Arjun Chavla. I'm a graduate student in International Relations here at the LSE. Thank you for an enriching talk. My questions for the panel is if you could discuss a little bit more about how you would see an explanation for the fragility of secularism, because the urgency of secularism in the Indian project has been spoken about and has been in discourse on multiple occasions. And yet we stand here today where the panel talks about Hindus and Muslims as homogeneous entities and almost this clash of civilizations, Samuel Huntington sort of way, as if though the Hindus and Muslims of India are in any way homogeneous entities, right? So how have we come here into where we're again discussing individuals, reducing them to their immediate identity on the basis of religion, when the whole idea of our nation state is one that's based on complex and complementary identities?
Thank you. And we'll take one more down here, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you. Professor Yadav spoke of the anxiety of Hindus around the existence of Muslims. Professor Yadav spoke of the anxiety of Hindus around the existence of Muslims in India. That anxiety also exists in countries like Germany, Hungary, the United States, amongst quite articulate and well-read people. Coming back to the discussion on India, I'd just like to ask your views on how much that anxiety is fueled by the fact that you have Pakistan along one side of India and Bangladesh on the other, and what do the geopolitics of the region fuel further the anxieties faced?
Didn't fully understand it, yeah.
Basically, it's not just India. There are other countries where majorities have this anxiety. Hungary is a good example. That's one. So is it in the anxiety of Hindus different? The second is how much of the anxiety in India is about being flanked by Pakistan and Bangladesh as two Muslim countries. So do you want to go first, or Yogendra?
No.
It is true that what you would call extremist Hindus who hold very strong views, some of them could be bloodthirsty, some of them could take pleasures in all kinds of things being done to Muslims. That's a microscopic minority. A very large, overwhelming majority of Hindus would fall in the category of those who are, like all ordinary people, subject to some prejudices, some little misgivings, and vulnerable to propaganda. But they're not bloodthirsty. The trouble is, and you see, the easiest thing for me in a hall like this would be to say, RSS did this, BJP did this. Of course they've been up to it. That's their job, that's what they've been up to, that's what they're doing for the last 90 years. But in a hall like this, to go and get away with it is lazy. I want to talk about what we did not do. And to my mind, one of the biggest failure of secular politics has been inability to sustain a conversation with that ordinary Hindu. You need to, Gandhiji, just remember, at the time, height of partition, these partition refugees are coming to Delhi. Just think of what their mental state must be. Every evening they confront the Mahatma. They would give all kinds of galis. Yet that man sustains a conversation with them. I think over the last 70 years, we've forgotten to sustain that conversation. It's a difficult conversation, but not as difficult as it must have been during partition. I think there's a sense of complacency in secular politics. We have a good constitution, we have Supreme Court, we have laws, and we rule this country. This arrogance has led the secular liberal elite into not even trying a serious conversation. RSS has had pracharaks. How many pracharaks has secular politics had in the last 70 years? RSS has worked for 90 years. Can we say that secular politics has worked for 90 months in this country to sustain and make serious effort? I'm not being flippant, Communist in the 50s made effort. Socialist in the 60s made efforts. But put together, would it amount to 90 months of serious, sustained effort at sustaining the foundations of this republic? That's missing. On the fragility of secularism, that's, in a sense, the point I'm making. I think it's not merely that secularism faces an onslaught, which it does, the biggest onslaught ever. This is the nightmare of Nehru, of Gandhi. It's also the nightmare of Vivekananda that we are facing today. But it's also a fragility within, inability to strengthen. Ideas like secularism have to be reinvented every 20 years. Every 20 years you have to give it a new vocabulary, a new proverb, a new way, you have to give it a fresh life. We haven't done that. Why are we so surprised if this is happening? On the anxiety, the only one thing that I completely take the point that this is not only happening in India, this is happening in many parts of the world, and we should put that in a broader perspective. Majorities behaving like minorities is quite a global syndrome, and there is something on global political economy that's taking place. I'm not too sure about Bangladesh and Pakistan, though, the geopolitics point. I think both Bangladesh and Pakistan, more than their existence in reality, it's the existence here that matters. The anxieties about, the anxieties are manufactured anxieties. On Bangladesh, the anxiety has to do with flow of population, which is somewhat real question. In the case of Pakistan, the whole thing is about propaganda that's happening. So I'm not sure if geopolitical challenge or threat, I mean, if there is any serious real threat out there. But it's what's being created through a lot of propaganda. That's the case.
Yeah, I agree with most of the things you said. I think the issue about Hungary and other areas is really very important. And in some respects, the big problem probably right now is more Hungary, Poland, and North Italy than India, despite everything together. Even though I say that with a slight sense of relief, because it doesn't, at least the trend of the recent elections indicate that we are not looking at the volcanic eruption that would take the whole country. I think there's every evidence that that's not the case. Whereas in Hungary and Poland and North Italy, and to some extent in parts of in the Trump basin in the United States, there is a real narrowness which we see, which is to be really worried about. So I'm certainly not saying that our problem is the biggest one, but I don't know that, to me, to be for Bangladesh or Pakistan to be a kind of real cause of a majoritarianism, as they say. It's not a majoritarianism because the majority of Hindus have never supported the RSS program. So I think to call it majoritarianism is to give them too much credit. It's minoritarianism of a especially narrow kind. I don't really know that, given the asymmetry, Pakistan might be more concerned about India than India is concerned about Pakistan. That was certainly the case before the nuclear bomb thing. When you think about what happened in the nuclear bomb, India had nuclear bomb down in the 1970s.
74.
It was sitting quietly in a position of superiority, and then, of course, it had an overwhelming majority with conventional forces. Pakistan always wanted to do some military nuclear test, but it seemed very difficult for Pakistan to do it without alienating the whole world. So India then created a wonderful situation by blasting some bombs, and then gave Pakistan, I think we blasted 5. Pakistan taught us a lesson in arithmetic, namely the smallest whole number larger than 5, which is 6. And they blasted 6 bombs. And that's it. So, and that put us in a state of symmetry, which was really created by an early BJP government. And if there was some move calculated to neutralize India's superiority, that was it. Now, I don't want India's superiority, so I don't like nuclear bombs. But on the other hand, I'm not worried that its superiority has gone. On the other hand, I don't really think, there is an element of paranoia in this too. And I think that paranoia could be played up. And I don't doubt that in the election it will be played up. When other cards are failing, that card will be played. I think you're a little too severe on people not having conversations with ordinary Hindus for 90 years. Now that I'm 84 and a half, 90 doesn't look that long, but it is a bloody long time. I have a sense that, it's very easy to look saying, where did we go wrong? And I would look for those things where we said one thing and did another. The Babri Masjid, the first calamity was done by Congress, not by the BJP. And I would look there, and I think there's a little bit of condescension. I'm not accusing you of that, in saying we don't talk with the ordinary people. We extraordinary people don't. So we have failed there. I don't entirely buy. Some people quite enjoy that. I'm not accusing you of that, but have a sense that we are not doing enough for the common people and bringing them into debate. I don't take the view that common people have great wisdom, but on matters of secularism and so on, I think there's very little to blame the common people about. I think it came from the leadership. It came from people in whose name various universities are being constructed these days, and they had very, very sophisticated view, partly of their own, partly learned from European sectarians like fascists, and copying them in the Hindu context. So, I think the common people have done pretty well without our help.
A good counterexample might be at the moment in the age of social media, where a certain kind of troll language, of trolling anything that is seen to be, that smells of liberal ideas. There is an army. Recently we had a photograph of the president of the BJP with the media team, as it's called euphemistically, which is basically the troll army. Now, where is the liberal troll army? Could be a question. How come we don't have right-wing views being trolled by more liberal views? We could have, that might have been one kind of riposte, a strategy, a real thinking. There's obviously a taking for grantedness of the secular fabric. Complacency.
So are not ordinary people.
They live under bridges.
No, they are extraordinary people. They spend their time doing these things.
Yeah.
I mean, not all of them may be as smart as the Russians have been in America, it appears. But on the other hand, they're pretty smart people. I get attacked so much by them, and I often have to admire their ability to really invent things, which is, one has said, what could I have said? And then ultimately you decide you said nothing that is distorted, you simply attributed. It's like the end of the election, when this Muslim woman won in the Quran seat, and said, attributed to her, that I celebrate this victory in the name of Islam. She had said nothing of the kind.
Complete fake.
So some of them are complete invention. Ordinary people don't invent things that much. You have to be pretty extraordinary to be able to think of that. The soul battle is a battle of, I think, demented smartness.
Let's take another final round of questions, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to take everybody's questions. So let's start with the second row. No, here. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Raza. I'm a third-year law student at the LSE. My question actually builds on some of the conversations we've had about the cultural vacuum, specifically by Yogendra. And you mentioned the inability to sustain a conversation with the ordinary Hindu. And it's a very introspective point, looking at the according blame in some sense and just past actions. But looking forward, who is going to lead this conversation in face of the real politic, which is the RSS and the BJP?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shelza and I'm an international politics student at SOAS. So my question is, since we are sitting here in London, how does the question or the language of secularism convert in the diaspora communities? Because when I, like you, talk to people here, it's even more difficult to have the conversation about Modi and his regime in India, even more difficult to tell them that there is a certain kind of propaganda. So that idea of secularism converging with traditions which are frozen converts in a very different manner as compared to the Indian population. So if you have any comment on that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah. And we'll take one more question from this young man here on the aisle, the dark jacket.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Manish. I work at the International Growth Center here at LSE. Basically, I'm stationed in Patna. I'm here for my training. My question is to Dr. Sen. Like you mentioned that we live in a world which is more than our country. Now, when we talk about secularism, how do you define do you define secularism within the boundaries of a country, or it should be more than more than the boundaries of a country? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll take one final question here in the front. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sanam. I'm a graduate of the LSE. We've touched upon during various parts of this conversation around ordinary Hindus not being able to sustain conversation with Hindus, not being able to, or feeling insecure, acting like minorities. My question is, we work with a lot of young Indian people who come here to study, to work, etc. And they almost do not want the idea of secular India. It's almost as though in this group we understand the urgency of secularism, whereas they are almost indifferent to the idea of secular to the point of not wanting a secular India, or that's what they seem to say, and I'm not sure they fully understand the implications of what they're saying. That's an observation we've had particularly in the Indian students who come here, in the Indian young professionals who come here. Is that something you're seeing on the ground, and what are your thoughts on this?
So you go first this time.
Well, let me then comment on two of these points, because there are too many, and you are going to take the rest. I think the See, I think the idea of secular is, Yogendra put it right early, that it came very late. In the sense we use it in India, you could describe it as coming late, but you could also describe it as coming the earliest in the world in terms of equal distance. And I think I know that I'm often thought to be biased towards Akbar, but I think I would say that, which actually could be Abul Fazl for all that I know, that came pretty early. But it's not a natural thought, secular. There are different religions and you treat them the same, and so on. Quite complicated. But there are things that we do, namely treat all human beings much the same. Don't create artificial barriers. And the claim here, in the context of governance of Akbar, is that it is an artificial barrier among my citizens for whom I am responsible. There may be some may be Hindu, some may be Muslim, but it's not a real barrier. Bear in mind, this is the time when Giordano Bruno is being burnt at when Akbar is making pronouncement. Giordano Bruno is being burnt at the stake in Rome, in Campo di Fiori, for apostasy. So first of all, there is some earliness of the sort, but the ultimate appeal there is of governance, that as someone who is responsible for law and order, I must treat them the same. It's an extraordinarily important thing, because the failure that we see today in India is precisely about governance, much more than anything else. You may say quite rightly that the destruction of the Babri Masjid wasn't. But, to me, I think the terrorizing of actual Hindus, actual Muslims, as opposed to destroying a mosque which is not been used for a while as a mosque, and there were terrible things to have happened. But in terms of failure of governance, one brings it out much more than the other. And I think I'm not certain that I fully understood the point, but to the extent I understood it, I wouldn't worry that people don't instantly say that I identify with secularism. It's quite a complicated idea. It's like sort of doing multiplication with table of 19 times 19, and so on. And not like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So I'm not worried about the failure of our rising to declaring ourselves the secular. But there are people who do that. Gandhiji does that, Rabindranath does that, Vivekananda does that, a lot of people do that. But it's a failure I'm ready to tolerate in a way that just generally making arbitrary distinction. They're not treating caste system, for example. We are talking about the threat to Muslims from the activist Hindus, but the threat to the lower caste have been absolutely vicious over thousands of years. 2,500 years ago, Gautam Buddha was grumbling about that. Grumbling also about lack of education. Very grumbling about bad health care. The 3 events that worried him, which made him go away, one was people dying of illness, suffering from illness, and people dying of illness, and I mean, these are all failures of a very basic kind. And I would say that secularism, as this, I suppose the title urgency of secularism, it is very important. I mean, there is a need for some politics there. And where I agree with him, but slightly differently, that I think the failure of the secular camp has been not to do enough on secularism as such. I think people got so worried about terms like pseudo-secularism, which is absolutely, when you think about it, if there is no secularism, there wouldn't be any pseudo-secularism either. So I think we lost the battle in that time. But the fact that people are not constantly repeating secularism it doesn't worry me in a way that they're treating people to be intrinsically unequal and having unequal rights does worry me. Okay, all right. No, then I just give up there.
Would you say something about diaspora? I don't understand the diaspora thing very well.
Only to say that, I mean, all I can say is I hear what you're saying. What has struck me with 25 years of teaching students who've grown up here, Indians who've grown up here, is this tradition of secular thought, whether it is Akbar, whether it's Ashok, whether it is pulling out this historical knowledge and this idea of India's, it's about history. That is almost an unknown territory to Indians who are growing up in Britain. So when we talk about the chauvinism of the Hindu outside India, it is one of, and these are conversations, difficult conversations that one has had, where there is a sense of complete and utter surprise that India has this history. So, you know, it's fantastic to have your account, Amartya, but that is the account that needs to be made much more organic to the imagination of India as children are learning about it. And that is precisely what is being reversed through the managing of the history curriculum, the contents of the textbooks.
That is why
that is exactly.
Also, I think one of the very great examples is the way the ethics, which has a really all India inheritance, has been captured by one group. And it doesn't help, of course, that Ram himself is a figure in Ramayana, though there's plenty of criticism of Ram in Ramayana itself. And I'm surprised when I was doing for Sheldon Pollack, I did the introduction to the Ramayana translation in the Clay Sanskrit Library. But it's people don't know how much discussion there is about whether Ram is doing the right thing by going away. Javali talks about that. Similarly, whether Ram is doing the right thing in putting Sita through all kinds of terrible testing and so on. And I think there is a need for innovative departures here. And I think we're failing, I agree with that. It's not so much we are not carrying the ordinary Indians. I mean, I must say, that's the one disagreement remains. I think I'm quite happy with ordinary Indians, but they should not be led into extraordinary direction by nasty and false propaganda. I think their ordinariness is their big protection, and I hope they will continue to have that.
Before you speak, Yogendra, sorry, Akhil, did you want to make a quick point or a quick question, but very quickly because we are really short of time. Can you please bring the microphone? Sorry, I can't.
This is Akhil Vilgami, Professor of Philosophy in Columbia. University, among many other things.
Yogendra's challenge to you, Amartya, is not really so much about ordinary people, but how secularism hasn't really found a conceptual vernacular to make its point part of the public imagination.
Conceptual?
Vernacular. Not a natural language vernacular, but a conceptual vernacular. It's, articulated in a vocabulary and in a set of frameworks which are not really from a vernacular conceptual idiom. I don't mean natural language vernacular. And that is a really deep and interesting thing that he's raised. Though on the other hand, Yogendra, when you say somebody like Gandhi kept the conversation going in a way that others haven't, the fact is that Gandhi never kept the conversation going on behalf of secularism. See, what he was tapping was an ancient and long-standing Indian unself-conscious pluralism. But he never ever saw that as a secularism, and he wasn't in any way formulating a conceptual vernacular to keep a conversation going with ordinary people for secularism. It was something else. So that's a challenge to you, I think.
Thank you.
Starting with what you said, that's my experience too. You see, the problem is that at an ordinary person, young or old, secularism is not your natural instinct. It's a difficult thought. It's not the most, stereotypes are natural. A bit of suspicion of others is something that happens quite naturally. But to be able to say, no, I should not participate in it, needs something else. It could come from personal experience. My father saw his own father being murdered when he was 8 years old in a communal riot. When he was 17, he saw the other thing. He saw Muslims being massacred in and around his village. He understands what is secularism. When he reads something in newspapers, I can see in his eye, he has only one eye, I can see that in his eye. He goes stiff. Beta ye nahi. He knows what is secularism. He knows the price. The trouble is that for this generation, we don't know the price. I began by saying something. I said, either we have secular India or we have no India at all. Now, this could be a nice sentence. This look like a glib formulation. But I mean every sense of it. The trouble is that this simple one sentence is something we are unable to translate to millions of young people today. We need to do that. School textbooks are school textbooks. They can be wonderful. Yeah, bad textbooks can make it very bad, but good textbooks do not necessarily make you secular. Something else needs to take place. That something else is missing, and that is politics. Politics is at the heart of modern India. It is the Yug Dharma. This is the central activity around which, at least for the last 100 years and possibly for the next 50, I can use all these loose formulations here, the society would revolve. And it is political education which is needed. That is missing. I would take Professor Sen's reprimand very seriously. It's not reprimand, but I take it as that. I would think hard about it. But for me, this is not a question of causal analysis of past. Something is happening in my country. Somebody is ripping the foundations of my country in front of my eyes. I need to do something. I cannot just blame him. I cannot say he's doing it, he's a bad guy, these are rascals, these are thugs. Yes, they are rascals. Yes, they are thugs. But that doesn't absolve me of my responsibility. What am I doing? And to me, the answer is also the answer to the other question. Who's going to do it? Who's going to lead this conversation? I'm serious about this pracharak business. RSS has pracharak. RSS has had pracharaks.
I know. One of them is the Prime Minister of India.
Yes, one of them is the Prime Minister of India, yes. And I think we have seriously underestimated the extent of influence these things have had in our country. When I was growing up, I knew some of these RSS activists. They were laughed at. They were no one took them seriously, but they were at it completely. Someone has to do this. This might look like political propaganda, but what do? I mean it absolutely seriously. The country needs political sadhus. We need 5,000 sadhus who would, each of them would say, and I mean, these are not weird things. Gandhiji used to do that. He would assign someone and say, for the rest of your life, you shall stay in this district and do this work. For the rest of your life, you shall promote Hindi. For the rest of your life, you will just simply settle in Mewat and ensure that Muslims who've come back to Mewat are resettled properly. We need something of that kind. Yes, I share Professor Sen's growing optimism about 2019 elections. Yes, for the last 10 days, I've had better sleep. But 2019 is not an answer, no matter what the result, unless we develop that capacity to cultivate that ordinary people's sense. Yeah. The idea that every single Indian is a minority. That's a message that has to be taken. Someone has to take that message. And maybe I'm not 84, I'm less wise, have seen less of the world. But I do feel very anxious about it. And this is a task cut out for our generation and for your generation. And yeah, I think this is something that brings me here.
I think I so much agree with many of the things you say. But ultimately, if there's a difficulty that I have, I think the remedy of a bad argument on one side is not a bad argument on the other side. The remedy of a bad argument is a good argument. And it seems
so in a sense, the remedy is that everyone should know Ramayana as well as you do.
I don't think we need pracharak. I don't think we need trolls. We do need resistance to trolls, certainly. And that could be done. And I think the real difficulty with taking the view of the pracharak view as a contra, fight back, as it were, it's not that I don't think that there's any situation where fighting would be a bad thing to do. It's often a very good thing to do. But the general approach of saying that they have done something which we haven't done. I mean, take this epic thing or the history thing that Mukulika was saying. If the history is distorted, the right answer is to present undistorted history, not counter-distorted history.
Absolutely, I agree completely. But and someone has to do that job.
No, I agree with that.
Who's
so
doing
on
it?
On that note, we can agree.
Yes.
Even you got...
I think it only remains formally for me to... I think we've heard a very important conversation this evening. I thank you all for being a terrific audience. Apologies to those who didn't get your questions in. And I really hope we can find the passion of Yogendra's activism and commitment to doing politics, not just talking about it, to Amartya's knowledge. I don't know many people who could talk about secularism who could make an offhand remark about how the Bhagavad Gita is not the best text to, no, but that is being done not in a dismissive way, but one from deep familiarity and knowledge. And that's the kind of position we aspire to. So I think this conversation has been a rare and a very valuable one, and collective thanks from all of us to both of you.